The cold metal of the handcuffs beat into my wrists with a clinical, unforgiving chill, a sensation I had authorized hundreds of times in my career but never expected to feel myself. I stood against the warm, sunset orange hood of my 1971 Lamborghini Miura, watching my own brother-in-law, Rick, tighten the zip ties with a smirk that curdled my blood. He didn't recognize the man he was arresting as the person who had just been appointed his superior. He only saw a man who didn't belong in this neighborhood, driving a car that cost more than his pension. He leaned in close, the smell of cheap coffee and stale cigarettes rolling off his uniform, and whispered that people like me should learn to stay in our lane before we get run over. Returning to Oak Ridge was supposed to be a quiet homecoming, a chance to breathe life back into my family's old estate and take up the mantle of police chief without the fanfare of a press conference. I wanted to see the department for what it really was before I sat behind the mahogany desk, to walk the streets as a citizen and feel the pulse of the town I'd left 15 years ago. My sister, Elena, was the only one who knew I was back, though even she didn't know the full extent of my new authority. She had invited me to dinner that first week, her voice over the phone sounding thin and brittle, a far cry from the vibrant girl I remembered. The evening at their house was draped in a forced, suffocating domesticity. The smell of roasting chicken and lemon zest filled the kitchen, but it couldn't mask the underlying tension that vibrated through the floorboards. Rick sat at the head of the table, his silver badge polished to a mirror sheen, his eyes tracking my every move with a mixture of suspicion and a deep-seated, simmering resentment. He kept checking his watch, his fingers drumming a restless rhythm on the floral tablecloth. "So, Marcus," Rick said, his voice dropping into that performative, gravelly bass he used when he wanted to assert dominance. "Elena says you're consulting now. Must be a lot of money in telling people how to do their jobs, considering that Italian scrap metal you've got parked in the driveway." I took a slow sip of my water, feeling the cool liquid slide down a throat that felt increasingly tight. "It's a restoration project, Rick. My father and I started it before he passed. It's more about the history than the price tag." Rick snorted, a sharp, ugly sound that made Elena flinch. "History, right. In this town, history is written by the people who actually stay and do the work, not the ones who run off to the big city and come back acting like they own the sidewalk. You see a car like that around here, it usually means someone's moving something they shouldn't be. It's a red flag, Marcus. A big, bright, expensive red flag." Elena reached out, her hand trembling slightly as she touched Rick's sleeve. "Rick, honey, he's my brother. Let's just have a nice meal." He shook her off, not with violence, but with a cold, dismissive jerk of his arm that spoke volumes about the hierarchy in their home. I watched the way her shoulders slumped, the way she pulled her hand back and tucked it under the table like a wounded animal. It was a subtle betrayal of the bond they were supposed to share, a slow erosion of her spirit that I hadn't been there to stop. I felt a flicker of heat in my chest, a spark of the old protective instinct, but I kept my face a mask of neutral professional calm. "I'm just saying," Rick continued, pointing a fork at me. "Oak Ridge has changed. We've got rules now. We've got a certain way of doing things to keep the peace. You might find that your big city credentials don't carry much weight when you're pulled over on a dark road and asked to account for yourself." The rest of the dinner passed in a blur of heavy silences, and Rick's pointed anecdotes about cleaning up the trash in the neighboring districts. He spoke about his power not as a responsibility, but as a weapon, a tool for carving out a world that suited his narrow, prejudiced vision. He viewed the badge as a shield against accountability, a license to bully anyone who didn't fit his definition of a good citizen. The Miura sat in the driveway, its sleek lines catching the moonlight, a silent witness to my departure that night. As I drove back to my temporary rental, the engine's low, rhythmic thrum usually acted as a balm for my nerves, but tonight it felt like a ticking clock. I had seen the way Rick looked at the car, not with admiration but with a predatory hunger. He didn't just hate the car, he hated that I had it. He hated that I had escaped the gravity of this town while he stayed behind, turning bitter in the shadow of his own insignificance. The next few days were spent in the shadows of the precinct, reviewing files and speaking with retired officers in hushed booths at the local diner. The stories I heard were consistent. Rick was the leader of a small insular group of officers who operated on intimidation and selective enforcement. They were a cancer in the department, one that had been allowed to grow because the previous chief had been too tired, or perhaps too frightened, to cut it out. The morning of the incident began with a deceptively clear sky, the air crisp with the scent of pine and damp earth. I decided to take the Miura out for one last long drive before I officially took command the following Monday. I was heading toward the coast road, the needle on the speedometer climbing steadily as the road opened up. I wasn't speeding, but I knew the car was a magnet for attention. It was a statement of success, of independence, and in a town like Oak Ridge, that was a dangerous thing to be. The blue and red lights exploded in my rearview mirror just as I crossed the township line. I felt a dull thud of recognition in my gut before I even saw the officer's face. I pulled over onto the gravel shoulder, the dust swirling around the low-slung doors of the Lamborghini. I kept my hands on the steering wheel, my heart rate steady, even as I watched Rick climb out of his patrol car, his hand resting heavily on his holster. He didn't approach the window immediately. He circled the car first, kicking the tires and trailing his fingers along the paint, leaving streaks of grime on the polished surface. When he finally reached the driver's side, he didn't ask for license and registration. He just leaned his elbow on the roof, peering in through the glass with a jagged, triumphant grin. "Well, well," he said, his voice amplified by the quiet of the road. "I told you, Marcus, some things just look too suspicious to ignore. Step out of the vehicle, slowly." "Is there a problem, officer?" I asked, my voice level, though my grip on the wheel tightened. "The problem is you, your car, and the fact that I don't like the way you breathe my air," he replied, his eyes narrowing. "Now out, before I have to assist you." I stepped out, the gravel crunching under my boots. The sun was hot on the back of my neck, but inside, I was beginning to feel a familiar, icy focus. This wasn't just a traffic stop, this was a performance. Rick was playing a role he had perfected over years of unchecked authority, unaware that today the audience was the very man who could bring the curtain down on him forever. He spun me around with a rough shove, the plastic ties biting deep as he cinched them tight. "You're making a mistake, Rick," I said softly, my face pressed against the warm metal of my car. "I don't make mistakes, Marcus," he hissed into my ear. "I make examples." The air was thick with the scent of ozone and heated rubber, the silence of the back road broken only by the rhythmic clicking of the cooling engine. Rick's partner, a young officer named Miller with a face still soft from adolescence, stood by the patrol car, his hand hovering nervously over his belt. He wouldn't look at me. He stared at the horizon, his jaw set in a line of forced indifference. I saw the way his fingers twitched, a classic sign of a man whose conscience was screaming, but whose fear of his superior was louder. "Is this how you spend your shifts, Rick?" I asked, my cheek still pressed against the Miura's orange paint. "Harassing motorists on a whim? I'm sure the taxpayers of Oak Ridge would love to hear about your productivity." "Shut it, Marcus," Rick barked. He was tossing the interior of my car with a reckless disregard that made my skin crawl. He threw the hand-stitched leather floor mats onto the gravel and began prying at the dashboard panels with a flathead screwdriver. "You were always the smart one, the one who got the scholarships, the one who moved to the city to make a difference. But out here, smart just means you're better at hiding things, and I'm going to find what you're hiding." As I watched him violate the car my father and I had spent 3 years restoring, the warning signs of the past few days began to crystallize in my mind, forming a picture I had been too nostalgic to see. 2 nights ago, when I'd stopped by Elena's to drop off a toy for my nephew, I'd heard them arguing through the screen door. Rick's voice had been a low, dangerous rumble, demanding to know where the old man's papers were kept. When I entered, Elena had quickly pulled down the sleeve of her cardigan, but not before I saw the dark, blooming violet of a thumbprint on her inner wrist. Then there were the questions. Rick had spent half of dinner asking about my father's old warehouse by the docks, the one I'd inherited along with the Miura. He'd couched it in concern, saying the property was a magnet for squatters, but his eyes had been hungry. He wasn't worried about the property, he was casing it.
Looking for something specific, Rick? I asked, my voice dropping an octave.
Or just hoping to find a way to pay off those gambling debts I heard about at the diner? I hear the local bookies don't have the same patience as the police department. Rick froze. He slowly climbed out of the car, his face flushed a deep, mottled purple. He walked over to me, his boots crunching the gravel with intentional weight. He didn't hit me, but he leaned in so close I could see the broken capillaries in his nose. You think you're so much better than me. You think because you have a fancy title in a city that doesn't care if you live or die, you can come back here and look down on us. We do the dirty work, Marcus. We keep the peace while people like you write memos. He turned back to the car, his movements more frantic now. He reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a thick, black leather portfolio. My heart skipped a beat, but not for the reason he thought. That folder didn't just contain the car's registration. It contained my life. It contained the formal commission from the governor, the internal affairs summary of the Oak Ridge PD corruption probe, and the badge that was currently worth more than Rick's entire career. What do we have here? Rick sneered, flipping it open. A little light reading for the road? That was the moment the world shifted. I felt a cold, sharp prickle of electricity race down my spine, starting at the base of my skull and radiating out to my fingertips. My pulse began to thud in my ears, a slow, heavy drumbeat that drowned out the sound of the wind in the trees. My vision narrowed until all I could see was Rick's face, the smug, arrogant tilt of his head as he began to scan the first page. I watched his eyes move, left to right, left to right. Then they stopped. The smugness didn't vanish all at once. It eroded, like a sandcastle being hit by a tide. His skin went from flushed to a sickly, translucent gray. The leather portfolio trembled in his hands, the pages rattling like dry leaves. He looked at the document, then at me, then back at the document. It was the official appointment of Marcus Thorne as chief of police, effective immediately, with a secondary document listing Officer Richard Vance as a primary subject in an ongoing racketeering investigation. "Rick?" Miller called out from the patrol car, sensing the sudden, heavy change in the atmosphere. "Everything okay? Did you find the, Rick didn't answer. He couldn't. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He looked like he was suffocating on dry land. The physical reality of his situation was hitting him with the force of a high-speed collision. I saw his knees buckle slightly, his weight shifting back against the door of my car for support. I stood up straight, as much as the handcuffs would allow. The victim persona fell away, replaced by the steel-edged authority I had honed over 15 years of command. My voice, when I spoke, wasn't the voice of his brother-in-law. It was the voice of his superior officer. "Read the second page, Rick," I said, my tone as cold and sharp as a winter frost. "The part about the unauthorized sale of seized narcotics from the evidence locker. The part where your own partner, Miller, gave a sworn statement to the state investigators 3 weeks ago in exchange for immunity." The silence that followed was absolute. Rick turned his head toward Miller, his expression one of pure, unadulterated betrayal. Miller finally looked up, his eyes filled with a mixture of terror and a strange, desperate relief. He didn't say a word. He just lowered his head and stared at the ground, his silence a deafening confirmation of Rick's ruin. You're the new chief?" Rick whispered, the words sounding like they were being dragged over broken glass. "I am," I said, stepping toward him until the zip ties on my wrists were the only thing separating us. "And you, Rick, are under arrest. Not by your brother-in-law, but by your commanding officer. Now, you're going to take these cuffs off me, and you're going to do it very, very slowly." The earth felt like it was tilting under my feet, the adrenaline finally hitting my system in a sickening wave of nausea. This was the point of no return. The bridge wasn't just burned, it had been vaporized. There would be no family dinners after this. There would be no working it out for the sake of Elena. I looked at Rick's trembling hands as he reached for the key, and I knew that the man who had terrorized my sister in this town was finally facing the one thing he couldn't bully: the truth.
Rick's hands were shaking so violently that the blade of the seatbelt cutter nipped the skin of my wrist before the plastic tie finally snapped. I didn't flinch. I just stood there, rubbing the circulation back into my hands, watching the sweat pour down his face. The sun was dipping lower, casting long, skeletal shadows across the road, turning the orange of the Lamborghini into a bruised, deep crimson.
Marcos, listen. Rick stammered, his voice climbing an octave, cracking with a desperate, pathetic edge. This is a misunderstanding, a field test. I heard reports of a vehicle matching this description, involved in a hit and run. I had to be sure. I was being thorough, for the safety of the town. Thorough? I echoed, my voice a low, dangerous hum. I stepped closer, forcing him to retreat until his back hit the side of his patrol car. You didn't ask for my ID. You didn't check the plates. You saw a man you've resented for 20 years and you thought you'd finally found a way to break him. You didn't realize that while you were playing king of the hill in this backwater, I was the one building the mountain. Miller, still standing by the front bumper of the cruiser, finally spoke. His voice was small, but it carried in the still air. He told me we were going to teach the city boy a lesson, Chief. He said you were arrogant and needed to be brought down a peg. He told me if I didn't help him, my career would be over before the probationary period ended. Rick spun around, his face contorting into a mask of pure, ugly rage. Shut up, Miller, you coward. You think he's going to protect you? He's been gone 15 years. He's a stranger. He turned back to me, his eyes darting around like a trapped rat. And what about Elena, Marcus? You think she wants to see her husband in orange? You think she wants her kids to know their father is a felon? If you do this, you're not just ruining me, you're destroying her life. Is that the homecoming you wanted? To be the man who tore his own sister's family apart? The mention of Elena's name was like a match dropped in a pool of gasoline. I felt the heat rise in my throat, a scorching, white-hot anger that I had to fight to keep under control. Don't you dare hide behind her, I hissed, stepping so deep into his personal space that our chests were almost touching. I saw the bruises, Rick. I saw the way she looked at you at dinner, like she was waiting for the next blow. You didn't build a family, you built a prison. And as for her life being destroyed, she's the one who gave me the key to your safe. That was the first real twist that broke his spirit. His mouth fell open, a silent "oh" of shock. That's right, I continued, leaning in until my whisper was the only thing he could hear. She's been documenting everything. Every late-night phone call, every envelope of cash you brought home, every time you bragged about taxing the local businesses. She didn't stay with you out of love, Rick. She stayed because she was waiting for someone strong enough to take you down. She knew I was coming back for the job before the ink was even dry on the contract. We've been talking for months. Rick staggered back, his knees hitting the gravel. He looked up at me, and for a second, the bravado vanished, replaced by a hollow, chilling silence. He looked at Miller, then at the empty road, then back at the folder in my hand. Then, he did something I didn't expect. He laughed. It was a dry, hacking sound that had no humor in it. You think you're so clever, he spat, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. You think a few documents and a scared wife are enough to bury me? I've got friends in the DA's office, Marcus. I've got people in this town who owe me their lives. You're the outsider. You're just a name on a piece of paper. In 24 hours, that commission of yours will be tied up in so many procedural errors, you won't be able to find your own desk. He reached into his pocket, and for a split second, my hand went to my own waist, but he didn't pull a weapon. He pulled out a small, clear baggie filled with white powder. Before I could react, he tossed it through the open window of my Lamborghini, right onto the driver's seat. Officer Miller, Rick said, his voice regaining its oily confidence. I believe we just found a controlled substance in plain view during a routine stop. And look at that, the suspect was resisting arrest. I had to use force to submerge him. Isn't that right? Miller looked at the baggie, then at Rick, his face pale and sweating. This was the moment, the second twist, the final escalation. Rick wasn't just a corrupt cop. He was a man who would destroy a $400,000 piece of history and frame his own family just to stay out of a cage.
Miller, I said, my voice steady. Choose very carefully whose side of the bars you want to be on when the sun goes down. Don't listen to him, Rick screamed, lunging for his holster. The move was sloppy, fueled by panic and a decade of unearned ego. Before his hand even touched the grip of his sidearm, I moved. I didn't use a weapon. I used the weight of his own momentum, stepping inside his reach and catching his wrist in a lock that sent him screaming to the ground. I pinned him against the gravel, my knee in the small of his back, exactly where he had pinned me moments ago.
The dashcam, Rick, I whispered into his ear as he struggled. You forgot the most basic rule of the new department. All vehicles were retrofitted with cloud-synced, tamper-proof cameras last month. Every word you said, every move you made, and that pathetic little toss of the baggie, it's already on a server at the state capitol. You're not just going to jail. You're going to be the lead story on the evening news. Rick went limp. The fight drained out of him all at once, leaving behind nothing but a broken, middle-aged bully in a dusty uniform. He let out a long, shuddering breath, the sound of a man watching his entire world dissolve into the dirt. Miller, I barked, not looking back. Call for transport, and tell them to send a flatbed for my car. We are doing this by the book, every single page of it. I stood over Rick, watching him groan in the dirt, and felt a strange, chilling stillness settle over me. The adrenaline that had been hammering against my ribs moments ago didn't vanish. It simply changed state, turning from a frantic heat into a cold, hard diamond of purpose. I wasn't just a man who had been wronged by his brother-in-law anymore. I was the law in this town, and the weight of that responsibility felt like a physical armor. I wiped a smudge of Rick's cheap hair gel off my palm onto my jeans and looked at Miller. The young officer was frozen, his hand still gripping the radio mic, his eyes darting between me and his fallen mentor. Miller, I said, my voice low and resonant, carrying the absolute authority of a man who didn't need to shout to be obeyed. The dashcam footage is already being uploaded to the state cloud. If you turn that radio off now, or if you fail to report exactly what you saw, you are an accessory after the fact. You have 10 seconds to decide if you want to spend the next decade in a cell next to him. Miller's hand shook, but he didn't hesitate. He keyed the mic. Dispatch, this is Unit 42. I need a transport unit and a supervisor at mile marker 14 on the coast road. We have an officer-involved incident, code 4, and send a flatbed for a 1085. Good choice, I said. I walked to the patrol car and reached through the open window, pulling the keys from the ignition. I walked back to Rick, who was trying to push himself up, spitting blood and gravel. I didn't help him. I reached down, grabbed his heavy-duty belt, and unclipped his badge. It came away with a sharp metallic snag of Velcro and leather. I held it up, the late afternoon sun glinting off the silver oak leaf of Oak Ridge. You don't deserve to carry this, I said, dropping the badge into the dirt next to his face. You used it as a hall pass for your own ego, Rick. You thought the badge made you a king. It's supposed to make you a servant. The ride to the station was conducted in a heavy, suffocating silence. I drove the Miura, the wind whipping through the cabin, while Miller followed in the cruiser with a handcuffed Rick in the back. When we pulled into the precinct parking lot, the shift change was just beginning. Officers were lounging near their cars, sipping coffee, laughing. That laughter died a sudden, strangled death as they saw Rick Vance, the man who ran the department like his own personal fiefdom, being led out of the back of a patrol car in his own handcuffs. I walked through the double-glass doors of the station, the leather portfolio tucked firmly under my arm. The desk sergeant, a man named Henderson, who I knew had been taking donations from local businesses for years, stood up, his face reddening. "What the hell is this?" Henderson barked, looking at Rick. "Miller, take those cuffs off him right now. Rick, what happened?" I didn't stop. I walked straight to the center of the room, behind the high mahogany counter, and slammed the portfolio down. I opened it to the page with the governor's seal and spun it around for Henderson to see. "My name is Marcus Thorne,"
I said, my voice cutting through the rising murmurs like a blade. As of 0800 hours this morning, I am the Chief of Police for the Oak Ridge Department. Officer Vance is under arrest for the planting of evidence, official misconduct, and aggravated assault. Officer Miller is a cooperating witness. Henderson, if you touch those handcuffs, I'll have you in the holding cell before your next breath. The room went so quiet, I could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. I watched the color drain from Henderson's face as he read the document. He looked at me, then at the bruised, disheveled Rick, and then back at the seal. He sat down heavily, his bravado collapsing into a heap of sweat and terror. The next few hours were a whirlwind of cold, calculated retribution. I didn't leave the station until the state police arrived to take custody of the evidence and Rick himself. I watched as they stripped him of his belt, his shoes, and his dignity.
He tried to catch my eye one last time as they led him away, a look of pathetic, pleading desperation. But I looked right through him. He wasn't family anymore. He was just a case file. I went to Elena's house that night. She was sitting on the porch swing, a glass of iced tea sweating in her hand. She didn't ask what happened. She just looked at my bruised knuckles and the way I held my shoulders, and she knew. She stood up, walked over to me, and buried her face in my chest. She didn't cry. She just exhaled, a long, shuddering breath that seemed to last a lifetime. The sound of a woman finally letting go of a decade of fear. "It's over, Elle," I whispered into her hair. "He's never coming back to this house." 6 months later, the Oak Ridge Police Department looks very different. Half the senior staff is gone, replaced by young men and women who actually want to protect their community. Henderson is retired, living in a trailer 2 states away to avoid the grand jury subpoenas. Rick is serving 8 years in a state penitentiary, his friends in the DA's office having turned on him the moment the cloud footage went public. I'm sitting on the porch of my father's old estate now. The Lamborghini is parked in the driveway, its orange paint gleaming under the soft glow of the porch light. The interior meticulously repaired and smelling of fresh leather and polish. The town is quiet, but it's a good kind of quiet. The silence of a place that is finally learning how to breathe again. Elena and the kids are inside, the sound of their laughter drifting through the screen door, a melody that used to be a rarity and is now the soundtrack of my life. I realized then that coming home wasn't about reclaiming a title or a piece of property. It was about cleaning the glass so the people I loved could finally see the light. I took a sip of my coffee, feeling the warmth spread through me, and looked out at the road I had been pulled over on all those months ago. The world will always have people like Rick, bullies who think a title gives them the right to dim someone else's light. But they always forget one thing. The truth doesn't need a badge to be powerful. It just needs someone brave enough to stand in its way. I leaned back in my chair, watching the stars come out over Oak Ridge. I was finally home, and for the first time in my life, the lane I was in was exactly where I was meant to be.